In the early hours of June 22, 1941, the world changed. 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces, crashed across the Soviet border in the largest invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa had begun, and the Nazi war machine rolled eastward with terrifying speed and violence. Cities burned. Armies disintegrated. Entire populations fled before the advancing tide of Wehrmacht divisions that seemed unstoppable. The Soviet Union, caught unprepared despite warnings, reeled under the initial onslaught. In the first weeks, hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire military districts ceased to exist. The speed of the German advance was unprecedented: 50, 60, sometimes 70 miles in a single day. By the end of summer, German forces would stand at the gates of Leningrad, approach the outskirts of Moscow, and occupy vast stretches of Ukraine and Belarusia. This was existential war without mercy or quarter. The Nazi ideology declared Slavic peoples subhuman, destined for enslavement or extermination. Behind the advancing armies came the Einsatzgruppen, death squads that murdered Jews, communists, intellectuals, and anyone deemed undesirable. This was not merely territorial conquest but a war of annihilation, and the Soviet people understood that defeat meant not just occupation but extinction as a nation and a people. Into this apocalyptic struggle, millions of Soviet citizens were mobilized. Men of all ages received draft notices and marched to assembly points, often with minimal training and inadequate equipment. Factories relocated eastward, beyond the Ural Mountains, to continue producing weapons out of German reach. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking positions in industry, agriculture, and increasingly, in the military itself. Among those who volunteered in those desperate early days was a 24-year-old university student from Kyiv named Lyudmila Pavlichenko. She was studying history at Kyiv University, preparing for a career in education or research. She had a young son, a failed marriage behind her, and a future that should have involved books, classrooms, and the quiet work of scholarship. Instead, she would become death itself, precise, patient, and utterly lethal. Over the next year, she would kill 309 enemy soldiers with confirmed accuracy, becoming the most successful female sniper in recorded history. Her story is one of transformation from civilian to warrior, from student to soldier, from young woman to legend. It is a story of courage, trauma, survival, and the terrible cost of war written in blood across the killing fields of the Eastern Front. But before she was the Iron Angel, before she was Lady Death, before her name became whispered with fear by German soldiers and spoken with pride by her comrades, she was simply Lyudmila, a girl who learned to shoot. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was born on July 12, 1916, in the small town of Bila Tserkva, south of Kyiv in what was then part of the Russian Empire. Her birth came in the midst of the First World War, during a time of tremendous upheaval that would soon lead to revolution, civil war, and the creation of the Soviet Union. Her early childhood was marked by the chaos and violence of those years, though like most children, she experienced them primarily through their effects on her family rather than directly. Her father, Mikhail, worked in various capacities, including as a factory worker. Her mother was also employed, as was common and increasingly necessary in Soviet society. The family eventually moved to Kyiv, Ukraine's ancient capital and one of the Soviet Union's major cities, where better opportunities and education were available. Kyiv was a city of broad boulevards and historic churches, of industry and culture, where Ukrainian tradition mixed with Soviet modernity. Lyudmila grew up in a society that, at least officially, proclaimed gender equality and encouraged women to pursue education and careers. Soviet ideology held that women were equal to men and should participate fully in building the socialist future. This was partly genuine ideological commitment and partly practical necessity. The Soviet Union needed all its citizens contributing to rapid industrialization and modernization. While traditional attitudes certainly persisted in practice, particularly in rural areas, young women in cities like Kyiv did have opportunities that would have been unthinkable in many other societies of the era. As a girl, Lyudmila was athletic, competitive, and strong-willed. She was not content to be passive or decorative. When she was about 14 years old, a boy in her neighborhood boasted about his shooting skills, dismissing the idea that girls could shoot. Lyudmila, stung by this casual dismissal, determined to prove him wrong. She joined a local shooting club, one of many such organizations that existed throughout the Soviet Union as part of the Oso-Aviakan program, a paramilitary sports society that trained civilians in military skills including shooting, parachuting, and aviation. At the shooting range, Lyudmila discovered a natural aptitude. Marksmanship requires a particular combination of physical and mental qualities: steady hands, good eyesight, breath control, patience, focus, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. She possessed these qualities. More than that, she enjoyed the challenge, the precision, the satisfaction of hitting exactly what you aimed at. Shooting became more than a hobby. It became a passion and a point of pride. Throughout her teenage years, she continued to train, developing her skills systematically. By her late teens, she had become an accomplished marksman, earning recognition in local competitions. This was not training her for war, or at least, that was not the conscious intention. It was sport, skill development, and a source of personal achievement. The shooting clubs were part of the broader Soviet emphasis on physical fitness and preparedness, but for most participants, including Lyudmila, it was recreation rather than military preparation. She married young, while still in her teens, to a man whose last name she took, Pavlichenko. The marriage produced a son, Rostislav, born when Lyudmila was still very young herself. But the marriage did not last. The details are scarce. This was private pain in a life that would later become very public. But by her early 20s, Lyudmila was divorced and raising her son with help from her family, a situation that was not uncommon in Soviet society. Despite the challenges of single motherhood in her early 20s, Lyudmila pursued education with determination. She enrolled at Kyiv University, one of the Soviet Union's prestigious institutions, to study history. This choice reflected her intellectual interests and her desire for a professional career. She was bright, hardworking, and ambitious, qualities that the Soviet system, at least in theory, rewarded. She attended lectures, wrote papers, and imagined a future as a historian or teacher, contributing to society through education and scholarship. She continued shooting as well, now at a more advanced level. She trained with rifles, developing the particular skills required for precision shooting at distance. The Soviet Union, remembering the effectiveness of snipers in the First World War and the Russian Civil War, maintained shooting programs and had begun developing doctrine for sniper employment. Lyudmila's skills were noticed, and she achieved rankings that marked her as an expert markswoman. This was her life in the spring of 1941, a 24-year-old university student, a mother, an expert shot, living in Kyiv with her family. She had plans, ambitions, and a future that seemed reasonably secure despite the hardships of Soviet life. The war raging in Western Europe seemed distant, despite the Nazi-Soviet pact that had temporarily aligned the two totalitarian powers. Soviet citizens were told their country was safe, that the Red Army was powerful, that war would not come. Then came June 22nd, and everything shattered. The German invasion was overwhelming in its scope and violence. Radio broadcasts announced that the motherland was in danger. Military-age men were mobilized. The city began preparing for possible siege or occupation. The reality became clear. The Soviet Union faced extinction, and every citizen would have to fight or contribute to the struggle for survival. Lyudmila, like millions of others, went to volunteer. But unlike most, she went with a specific skill that would prove devastatingly effective in the terrible war to come. The recruitment office in Kyiv in late June 1941 was chaos. Thousands of people, mostly men but also women, crowded forward to enlist. The atmosphere combined patriotic fervor, genuine fear of Nazi invasion, and the practical reality that military service was rapidly becoming mandatory for all eligible men. Officers and clerks struggled to process the flood of volunteers and conscripts, taking names, conducting hasty medical examinations, and assigning people to units with whatever logic could be imposed on the chaos. When Lyudmila presented herself and stated she wanted to serve as a sniper, she was met with skepticism bordering on dismissal. Women were being recruited for support roles, medical personnel, communications, logistics, but not for combat positions. The idea of a young woman, a university student with a child, becoming a frontline sniper seemed absurd to the harried recruitment officers. They suggested she join the nursing corps or work in support services. Lyudmila refused. She had not come to roll bandages or type reports. She had come to fight. She insisted on her qualifications, mentioned her shooting club experience and her rankings. The officers were dismissive until she produced her marksmanship certifications and documentation of her shooting achievements. The paperwork showed she was a certified expert marksman, with scores that matched or exceeded those of many male recruits. Faced with this evidence, and perhaps recognizing that the desperate military situation meant any skilled shooter was valuable regardless of gender, They reluctantly agreed to test her. The test was simple but definitive. Hit targets at increasing distances with standard military rifles. Lyudmila performed flawlessly, grouping shots with precision that impressed even skeptical observers. Her breathing was controlled, her position stable, her trigger control smooth. These were not lucky shots but demonstrated mastery. The officers conferred briefly and accepted her for sniper training. She was assigned to the Red Army's 25th Rifle Division as a sniper, one of very few women in that role. The training she received was abbreviated by necessity. In peacetime, sniper training might take months, carefully developing skills and knowledge. In June 1941, with the Wehrmacht advancing daily and the Soviet military desperate for every trained soldier, training was compressed into weeks. Fortunately, Lyudmila already possessed the fundamental shooting skills. What she needed to learn were the specific techniques of military sniping, which differed significantly from sport shooting. She was issued the standard Soviet sniper rifle, the Mosin-Nagant 1891-30 with a 3.5x PU scope. This rifle was a bolt-action design dating back to the 1890s, upgraded in the 1930s with improved accuracy and fitted with optical sights for sniper use. It was chambered in 7.62x54 mmR, a powerful cartridge effective at long ranges. The rifle was long, heavy, and robust, built for reliability under harsh conditions rather than for ergonomics or comfort. For a woman of Lyudmila's size, it was a substantial weapon, but she had trained with similar rifles and managed it competently. Military sniper training emphasized camouflage, fieldcraft, patience, and tactical employment rather than just marksmanship. A sniper's primary skill was not shooting, that was assumed, but the ability to position oneself within enemy territory, remain undetected for hours or days, identify high-value targets, and escape after taking the shot. This required understanding terrain, mastering concealment, controlling all bodily needs and impulses, and developing almost superhuman patience. Lyudmila learned to construct concealed positions using natural materials. She practiced moving silently and invisibly across open ground. She studied how to read terrain for fields of fire and escape routes. She learned to estimate range by eye and to account for wind, temperature, and other environmental factors affecting bullet trajectory. She studied German uniforms and rank insignia to identify officers and specialists. She learned the sniper's fundamental rule: one shot, one kill, then relocate immediately. The training was physically demanding. She had to carry the rifle, which weighed over 4 kilograms, plus ammunition, water, rations, and other gear, across difficult terrain. She had to hold positions for extended periods without movement, ignoring discomfort, hunger, thirst, and fatigue. She had to function on minimal sleep and under constant stress. The training broke some recruits, but Lyudmila endured. She had determination born of necessity. She had volunteered for this, insisted on it, and she would not fail. During training, she also faced the social challenge of being one of very few women in a combat role. The Soviet military was more accepting of women in combat than most armies. Necessity and ideology combined to open doors that remained closed elsewhere, but it was still predominantly male, and attitudes ranged from supportive to skeptical to hostile. Some men questioned whether women had the physical and psychological capacity for combat. Some resented their presence. Others were simply uncertain how to relate to female comrades in arms. Lyudmila handled this with a combination of professional competence and personal toughness. She proved herself through performance, outperforming many male recruits in shooting and demonstrating equal capacity for the physical hardships of training. She did not seek special treatment or accommodation. She established herself as a soldier first, with gender being secondary. This approach earned respect from most of her fellow trainees and instructors, though undoubtedly there remained those who never fully accepted her. By late July or early August 1941, Lyudmila's training was complete, or as complete as time allowed. The strategic situation was catastrophic. German forces were advancing on multiple fronts. Kyiv itself was threatened. The 25th Rifle Division was desperately needed at the front. There was no more time for training, no opportunity to develop skills further in safe conditions. She was as ready as she would ever be. She was issued her rifle, ammunition, equipment, and uniform. She said goodbye to her family, including her young son Rostislav, not knowing if she would see them again. Her mother would care for the boy while Lyudmila went to war. It was a moment of terrible finality, leaving behind everything familiar and safe to enter a realm of violence and death. Many soldiers making similar farewells would never return. The 25th Rifle Division was deployed to defend Odessa, the major port city on the Black Sea coast. German and Romanian forces were advancing toward it, and its defense was considered critical for maintaining Soviet presence on the southern flank and keeping the Black Sea Fleet's access to ports. Lyudmila traveled south with her unit, moving toward the sound of guns, toward the front, toward the place where she would be transformed from a student who knew how to shoot into a warrior who knew how to kill. Odessa in August 1941 was a city preparing for siege. The beautiful port city, with its elegant architecture and strategic location on the Black Sea, had been a jewel of southern Russia since its founding in the late 18th century. Now it became a fortress. Civilians evacuated or prepared to endure bombardment. Soldiers and sailors fortified positions. The Black Sea Fleet provided naval artillery support and supply lines. The defenders knew they were being cut off, that relief was unlikely, but they also knew that every day Odessa held tied-down Axis forces that might otherwise be used elsewhere. The 25th Rifle Division took positions in the defensive perimeter around the city. The terrain was relatively open, rolling steppe land with occasional villages, ravines, and agricultural areas. There was little natural cover, which made defensive operations difficult but also created opportunities for snipers who could use concealment to dominate open areas. For Lyudmila, the first days at the front were overwhelming. The constant noise of artillery and small arms fire, the smell of smoke and high explosives, the sight of wounded soldiers being evacuated, the knowledge that any moment might bring death, all of this bore down with crushing psychological weight. Training could simulate many things, but not this totality of industrial violence. She was afraid, as any sane person would be, but she had volunteered for this and would not show weakness or retreat from her chosen role. Her unit took position in defensive trenches facing Romanian positions. The Romanian army, allied with Germany, made up a large portion of the besieging force around Odessa. They were less well-equipped and trained than German units but were present in large numbers and under orders to reduce the city. The front lines settled into a pattern of probing attacks, artillery exchanges, and small unit actions rather than massive assaults. Both sides were consolidating and preparing for larger operations. In this environment, snipers became critical assets. A well-positioned sniper could dominate an area, making it deadly for enemy soldiers to move or observe. They could eliminate officers, machine gunners, artillery observers, and other high-value targets, disrupting enemy operations. They provided a way for defenders to inflict casualties while minimizing risk to themselves, a precious advantage when every soldier was needed. Lyudmila was assigned to work with an experienced male sniper as a spotter-sniper team, standard Soviet practice. Snipers typically worked in pairs. One would shoot while the other observed through binoculars or a spotting scope, identifying targets, calling range and wind corrections, and watching for threats. The spotter could also engage targets with his own rifle when opportunities arose. This arrangement provided mutual support and improved effectiveness. Her first kill came within days of arriving at the front. The exact circumstances, like many details of individual combat actions, are not recorded in surviving documents, but Pavlichenko later recounted that her first targets were Romanian soldiers moving carelessly in what they thought was a safe area. She was positioned in concealment, waiting with the patient intensity that defines sniper work. When a target presented itself, a soldier moving into a clear area at a range where she was confident of a hit, she took the shot. The Mosin-Nagant's 7.62x54 mmR cartridge generated substantial recoil and a loud report. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The target fell. She worked the bolt action smoothly, chambering another round, her scope returning to the target area. The soldier did not move. Her first kill was confirmed. The psychological impact of taking a human life is profound and individual. Some soldiers find killing in combat relatively manageable psychologically, particularly when filtered through distance and optical sights. Others are traumatized by it. Lyudmila later described that her first kills affected her deeply, that she had to consciously convince herself that she was killing enemies who were invading her country, who would kill her and her comrades and her people if given the chance. She framed it as necessary defense, as patriotic duty, as survival. This mental framework, combined with the desensitization that comes with repeated exposure to violence, allowed her to continue. Over the following days and weeks, her kill count grew. She hunted systematically, learning the rhythms of the front, identifying positions where enemy soldiers became careless or exposed. She learned to read terrain and predict where targets would appear. She developed the patience to wait hours for a shot. She learned to control the adrenaline response that could make hands shake and breathing irregular. She became a professional killer, refining her craft with each engagement. The work was grueling physically and mentally. She would move into position before dawn, crawling slowly to avoid detection. She would lie motionless for hours in her concealed position, ignoring discomfort, heat, thirst, and the need to urinate. She would maintain focus despite fatigue and boredom. When opportunity arose, she would take the shot, then either remain in position or relocate immediately depending on tactical circumstances. She might spend an entire day in the field for a single successful engagement. Then she would return to her unit, clean her rifle meticulously, eat if food was available, sleep if possible, and prepare to do it again. The siege of Odessa lasted from August to October 1941, with Soviet forces holding out far longer than German and Romanian commands expected. The defense tied down significant Axis forces and delayed their operations elsewhere. For the defenders, it was a desperate struggle marked by shortages of supplies, constant bombardment, and steady attrition. For Lyudmila, it was an intensive education in combat sniping under the worst possible conditions. By the end of the siege of Odessa, Lyudmila had accumulated a significant number of confirmed kills. Some sources suggest over 100, though exact records from this period are incomplete. What is certain is that she had become a known and feared sniper, that her skills and nerve under fire had been proven, and that she had survived the baptism of fire that killed or broke many new soldiers. In mid-October 1941, Soviet command made the strategic decision to evacuate Odessa rather than let the defenders be destroyed in a final assault. The Black Sea Fleet conducted a brilliantly executed evacuation operation, pulling out over 30,000 soldiers and substantial equipment under cover of darkness and naval artillery. Lyudmila and her unit were evacuated by sea to Sevastopol, the great fortress port in Crimea where Soviet forces were concentrating for another desperate defense. She had survived her first campaign. She had proven herself under fire. She had killed enemy soldiers with cold efficiency. She was no longer a student who could shoot. She was a combat veteran, a sniper, a soldier. And the hardest fighting was yet to come. Sevastopol was different. Where Odessa had been a desperate improvised defense, Sevastopol was a fortress, one of the most heavily fortified positions in the world. Built in the 19th century and strengthened continuously since, it featured deep underground bunkers, massive coastal artillery batteries, reinforced concrete emplacements, and defensive positions built into the rocky terrain of the Crimean Peninsula. The Soviet Black Sea Fleet made Sevastopol its primary base, adding naval power to the land defenses. German command recognized that Sevastopol had to be taken. As long as Soviet forces held it, they threatened the entire German southern flank, tied down substantial Axis forces, and provided a base for counterattacks. Beginning in late October 1941, German and Romanian forces began operations to reduce the fortress. What followed was an 8-month siege that would become one of the most brutal battles of the entire Eastern Front. The terrain around Sevastopol was rugged, rocky hills, deep ravines, cliffs dropping to the sea. There were few roads, and movement was difficult. This terrain favored defenders but also created opportunities for infiltration and small unit actions. It was ideal terrain for snipers on both sides, and the battle would see intensive sniper warfare as both German and Soviet sharpshooters hunted each other with lethal focus. Lyudmila's unit took positions in the outer defensive perimeter. The German assault began with artillery bombardments of incredible intensity. Sevastopol would eventually receive more concentrated artillery fire than almost any other location in the war. Hundreds of thousands of shells, including rounds from the massive siege guns that the Germans brought specifically for this battle. The bombardments turned the landscape into a moonscape of craters, destroyed vegetation, and shattered rock. The noise was constant and overwhelming, a physical force that made communication difficult and sleep nearly impossible. Between bombardments came infantry assaults. German forces, including elite mountain troops experienced in difficult terrain, attacked repeatedly to take key positions and reduce the defensive perimeter. These attacks were met with determined resistance from Soviet defenders who knew that every meter of ground lost brought the enemy closer to the city and the fleet. The fighting was savage, often at close quarters, with positions changing hands multiple times as attack and counterattack surged back and forth across the rugged ground. In this environment of extreme violence, Lyudmila continued her deadly work. The siege conditions actually enhanced the effectiveness of snipers. The static nature of siege warfare meant that soldiers had to occupy fixed positions for extended periods, creating predictable patterns. Supply routes had to be used repeatedly. Communication trenches became familiar paths. Officers had to move between positions to coordinate defenses. All of this created opportunities for patient snipers who studied the patterns and waited for targets. Lyudmila developed her own methods and routines. She would carefully study the terrain through her scope and binoculars, memorizing every feature, every position where enemy soldiers might appear. She learned to identify the subtle signs of enemy sniper positions, the slight discoloration of camouflage that didn't quite match natural vegetation, the geometric edge of a loophole in a building, the faint shadow that suggested a concealed position. She learned to think like her opponents, to anticipate where they would position themselves and what angles they would use. Her typical day began before dawn, moving into position while darkness still provided concealment. She would settle into a prepared hide or construct a hasty concealed position using rocks and sparse vegetation. Then came the waiting, hours of absolute stillness, maintaining focus despite discomfort and fatigue. Her eyes would scan continuously through the scope, looking for movement, for anything inconsistent with the static landscape. When a target appeared, an officer moving between positions, a machine gun crew repositioning their weapon, a supply party carrying ammunition, she would assess the range, account for wind and slope, control her breathing to minimize movement, and press the trigger with smooth, steady pressure. The Mosin Nagant would bark and buck. The target would fall. She would work the bolt action, chambering a fresh round, watching to confirm the kill and assess whether enemy forces could locate her position from the muzzle blast and report. If the position was compromised, she would withdraw immediately, moving carefully to a new location. If she judged she remained undetected, she might take additional shots if other targets presented themselves. Then more waiting, more watching, more hunting. The psychological toll of this work was immense. Modern understanding of combat trauma recognizes that snipers face unique stresses. Unlike soldiers engaged in mass combat where violence is impersonal and targets are indistinct, snipers see their targets clearly as individuals. Through the magnification of the scope, you see faces, expressions, human details. You select a specific person and make a conscious decision to end that life. Then you watch the result through the scope, the target collapsing, sometimes the reactions of nearby soldiers to their fallen comrade. This intimate violence, repeated daily for months, creates psychological burdens different from other forms of combat. Lyudmila later acknowledged that she was changed by this work, that the constant killing affected her deeply. She described having dreams of the men she had killed, of seeing their faces. She spoke of the necessity of psychological compartmentalization. During operations, she could not think of her targets as human beings with families and lives but had to view them as threats to be eliminated. Off-duty, when the emotional barriers lowered, the weight of what she was doing would press down. She dealt with this through the common soldier's methods: dark humor shared with comrades, alcohol when available, and immersion in military routine that left little time for reflection. The camaraderie among Soviet snipers provided essential emotional support. They understood the unique stresses of the role in ways that other soldiers could not. They shared techniques, warned each other about known enemy sniper positions, and mourned together when one of their number was killed. Lyudmila formed particularly close bonds with other female snipers who faced both the standard combat stresses and the additional pressure of proving themselves in a role where they were not universally accepted. Among the enemy, Lyudmila's growing reputation began to create its own effects. German soldiers reportedly learned to recognize the sectors where she operated and became extremely cautious about exposure. Officers moving between positions would do so quickly and unpredictably. Soldiers would refuse to undertake certain movements during daylight. The psychological impact of an effective sniper extends far beyond the actual casualties inflicted. An entire sector of front can be paralyzed by fear of a single skilled shooter. The Germans responded by deploying their own snipers specifically to hunt their Soviet counterparts. These sniper duels, one trained killer hunting another across the ruined landscape, were battles of patience, nerve, and tactical intelligence. Each side would try to identify the other's position through careful observation, sometimes over days. They would study muzzle flashes, calculate angles of fire from where casualties fell, look for the telltale signs of concealed positions. When one sniper located another, the engagement became intensely personal, a test of who could shoot first and more accurately when both were expecting danger. Lyudmila survived multiple such encounters, demonstrating not just marksmanship but field craft and tactical awareness. She understood that staying alive was as important as killing enemies, that a dead sniper helped no one regardless of their previous record. She religiously followed sniper protocols, never used the same position twice if avoidable, never establish patterns that enemy snipers could predict, always have multiple escape routes planned, relocate after taking a shot if there was any possibility of position compromise. This disciplined adherence to tactical principles kept her alive while less careful snipers died. As weeks turned into months, the siege ground on with relentless intensity. The German forces made steady progress, compressing the defensive perimeter despite fierce Soviet resistance. Supply lines to Sevastopol became increasingly tenuous as German forces advanced along the coast and German aircraft dominated the skies. Food became scarce. Ammunition was rationed. Medical supplies ran low. The defenders, including Lyudmila and her unit, endured worsening deprivation even as combat intensity remained high. The winter of 1941-42 brought additional hardships. While Crimea's climate was milder than northern Russia, it was still winter, with cold rain, occasional snow, and persistent damp that penetrated inadequate clothing and made living conditions in exposed positions nearly unbearable. Trench foot and other cold weather injuries added to combat casualties. Soldiers fought not just the enemy but exposure, disease, and exhaustion. Through all of this, Lyudmila continued her work with grim determination. Her confirmed kill count climbed steadily, 200, then 250, then beyond. Each number represented a human life ended by her skill and decision. The psychological burden accumulated even as her technical expertise reached extraordinary levels. She was becoming one of the most effective snipers on the entire Eastern Front, but the cost in psychological wear was severe. In the spring of 1942, the Germans launched a renewed offensive to finally take Sevastopol. They brought in massive reinforcements, including heavy artillery and specialized siege units. The bombardment intensified to levels that defied description. At peak intensity, thousands of shells per day fell on the shrinking defensive perimeter. The noise was constant and overpowering. The ground shook continuously. Buildings disintegrated. Trees were reduced to splinters. The very landscape was reshaped by explosives. Under this barrage, Soviet defenses slowly crumbled. Positions that had held for months were finally overwhelmed. The perimeter contracted day by day, week by week. Casualties mounted horrifically on both sides, but the outcome was becoming inevitable. The Germans had unlimited supplies and reinforcements. The defenders, cut off and surrounded, had only what they could evacuate by sea under constant air attack. It was during this final phase of desperate defense that Lyudmila was wounded. The exact date in June 1942 is uncertain from available records, but what is clear is that she was caught in an artillery or mortar barrage, where the German or possibly from misdirected Soviet supporting fire is unknown. Shrapnel struck her, causing wounds serious enough to require evacuation but not immediately fatal. She was carried from the front lines to an aid station, then evacuated by sea from Sevastopol during one of the final evacuation missions before the city fell. The evacuation saved her life. On July 4, 1942, after 8 months of siege that had consumed tens of thousands of lives on both sides, Soviet resistance in Sevastopol collapsed. The remaining defenders either surrendered or attempted to escape into the surrounding countryside. Most were killed or captured. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Soviet Union, surrendering the Crimean Peninsula and the Black Sea Fleet's main base. For the individual soldiers who had defended the city with such determination, it was the end of a terrible ordeal that many did not survive. Lyudmila, recovering from her wounds in a hospital well behind the lines, was one of the survivors. Her combat record was extraordinary by any measure. Over approximately 10 months of continuous frontline service at Odessa and Sevastopol, she had achieved 309 confirmed kills, each one verified by her spotter or commanding officers according to Red Army procedure. This made her the most successful female sniper in recorded military history and placed her among the top-performing snipers of any gender in the entire war. But her frontline service was over. Her wounds, while they would heal, were serious enough that she would not return to combat duty. And Soviet command, recognizing the propaganda value of her story, had other plans for her service to the war effort. As Lyudmila recovered in the hospital during the summer of 1942, the strategic situation for the Soviet Union remained desperate. The German summer offensive of 1942 was driving deep into southern Russia, threatening the Caucasus oil fields and Stalingrad on the Volga River. The Red Army was fighting for survival, and the Soviet leadership was fighting to maintain morale and secure support from the Western Allies. In this context, individuals with extraordinary records like Lyudmila's became valuable as propaganda assets. Soviet authorities carefully controlled information about the war, emphasizing heroism and sacrifice while minimizing defeats and casualties. Heroes were celebrated, Their stories told in newspapers and on radio, their images used to inspire the population and demonstrate Soviet strength and determination. A young woman who had killed over 300 German invaders was an ideal propaganda figure. Her story combined patriotism, courage, revenge against the invaders, and the progressive Soviet claim of gender equality. Lyudmila was pulled from the hospital before fully recovered and brought to Moscow. She was interviewed extensively, her story shaped and polished for public consumption. She was given a uniform with decorations, photographed for newspapers and newsreels, and prepared for public appearances. This transformation from combat soldier to propaganda figure was jarring, trading the visceral reality of the front for the staged performances of public relations. But it was not optional. The Soviet system demanded that individuals serve where they were needed, and Lyudmila was now needed as a symbol rather than a shooter. She was awarded the Order of Lenin, one of the Soviet Union's highest decorations, in recognition of her combat service. The award ceremony was public and widely reported. Her photograph appeared in newspapers across the Soviet Union, showing a young woman in uniform with intense eyes and a serious expression that hinted at the trauma behind the heroic narrative. The caption described her record, her courage, and her service to the motherland. She became famous throughout the Soviet Union virtually overnight. But Soviet propaganda alone was not sufficient to change the war's trajectory. The Soviet Union desperately needed material support from its Western allies, particularly the United States, which was mobilizing its massive industrial capacity for war production. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin continually pressed the Western allies to open a second front in Europe to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front, but the United States and Britain were not yet ready for such an operation. In the meantime, the flow of American weapons, vehicles, food, and raw materials under the Lend-Lease program was vital to Soviet survival. To strengthen support for the Soviet Union among the American public and to pressure the American government for greater assistance, Soviet authorities organized a delegation to visit the United States in late 1942. The delegation was designed to put human faces on the Soviet struggle and to demonstrate Soviet determination and capability. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was selected as a member of this delegation, specifically because her story was compelling and because her presence as a young woman warrior would capture American imagination. In August 1942, Lyudmila departed the Soviet Union for the first time in her life, traveling by air and sea to the United States. The journey itself was hazardous. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, and air routes crossed through conflict zones. But she arrived safely, joining the Soviet delegation in New York City. America in 1942 was a nation at war but largely secure from direct attack. The industrial economy was booming with war production. Cities were crowded and energetic. For Lyudmila, coming from besieged Sevastopol and war-ravaged Soviet Union, the plenty and normalcy of America must have been almost surreal. Here were cities with lights at night, shops full of goods, people concerned with peacetime matters. The contrast with her recent experience of constant bombardment, starvation rations, and mass death could hardly have been more stark. The American press seized on her story with enthusiasm. Here was a beautiful young woman who had killed 309 enemy soldiers, a narrative that combined violence, heroism, and the transgression of gender norms in ways that fascinated the American public. Reporters crowded around her at every appearance, asking endless questions about her combat experiences, her feelings about killing, and her views on women in combat. The coverage often carried condescending undertones, surprise that a woman could be an effective soldier, focus on her appearance rather than her accomplishments, questions about whether she wore makeup on the front lines. Lyudmila handled these interactions with directness that sometimes startled her American audiences. She had not come to discuss fashion or romance. She had come representing a nation fighting for survival, and she spoke about the grim realities of the Eastern Front with blunt honesty. When reporters asked frivolous questions about her appearance, she responded that in the Soviet Union, women were judged by their work and contributions rather than their looks. When asked if she used her feminine charms on the battlefield, she replied curtly that she used her rifle. Her seriousness and the hint of steel beneath her public persona fascinated audiences who had expected something softer and more conventionally feminine. The tour took her across America, New York, Washington, Chicago, and other cities. She spoke at rallies, gave interviews, met with officials and public figures. Everywhere, she delivered the same essential message. The Soviet Union was bearing the primary burden of fighting Nazi Germany. Soviet people were dying in vast numbers, and America needed to provide maximum support and open a second front as soon as possible. This was the political purpose of her visit, and she executed it with the discipline of a soldier following orders. During this tour, she developed an unexpected friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States. Mrs. Roosevelt was a towering figure in American public life, politically engaged, progressive on social issues, and genuinely curious about the world. She was intrigued by Lyudmila, seeing in her both a symbol of women's capabilities and a real person bearing heavy psychological burdens. Eleanor Roosevelt invited Lyudmila to stay at the White House as a guest, an extraordinary honor that signaled official recognition and support. During private conversations, the two women connected on a human level beneath their public roles. Mrs. Roosevelt recognized the trauma and exhaustion beneath Lyudmila's heroic image. Lyudmila, for her part, found in the older woman a sympathetic listener who understood that her public role as a symbol was both necessary and burdensome. Their friendship persisted beyond Lyudmila's American tour. They corresponded after she returned to the Soviet Union, maintaining contact despite the political and geographic barriers between them. Years later, Eleanor Roosevelt would visit the Soviet Union and meet with Lyudmila again. This personal connection between two women from radically different worlds, maintained across Cold War divisions, spoke to genuine mutual respect and affection. The American tour also took Lyudmila to Canada, where she spoke to audiences about the Soviet-Canadian alliance against fascism. The reception was similar: fascination with her story, admiration for her courage, and some discomfort with a young woman who spoke matter-of-factly about killing. Everywhere, she maintained her message: remember that Soviet people are dying by the millions to stop Hitler, and the Western Allies must do more to support the fight. By late 1942, Lyudmila returned to the Soviet Union. She had fulfilled her propaganda mission successfully. American public opinion remained largely supportive of aid to the Soviet Union, though the Second Front would not open until 1944. She had become an international figure, her story known not just in the Soviet Union but in Allied nations worldwide. She was a symbol of Soviet resistance, of women's capabilities, and of the terrible cost of the war against fascism. But she was also exhausted, traumatized, and removed from the identity that had defined her for the past year and a half. She was a sniper, a soldier, someone whose skills and identity were forged in combat. Now she was a symbol, a propaganda figure, someone whose image and story were used for political purposes. The transition from warrior to icon was complete, but it left her in a strange liminal space, celebrated for what she had done but no longer able to do it. For the remainder of World War II, Lyudmila Pavlichenko never returned to combat. Her wounds had healed, but her combat days were over. Soviet command assigned her to training roles, where she shared her hard-won expertise with new sniper recruits. This was valuable work. Her tactical knowledge and practical experience made her an excellent instructor, but it lacked the intensity and purpose of frontline service. She was teaching others to do what she could no longer do herself. She instructed at various sniper schools, demonstrating techniques, sharing lessons learned through bitter experience, and trying to prepare young soldiers for the psychological as well as technical challenges they would face. She emphasized the importance of patience, discipline, and adherence to tactical protocols. She taught the field craft that kept snipers alive. She tried to convey the psychological realities they would face, the burden of killing, the constant fear, the necessity of emotional control. Some students were in awe of her reputation. Others were skeptical, particularly male recruits who resisted instruction from a woman. She handled both reactions with professional detachment, focusing on sharing knowledge that might keep these soldiers alive. Beyond training, she remained valuable for propaganda purposes. She continued to make public appearances, speak at rallies, and give interviews. Her story was told in newspapers, books, and films. She was presented as a model Soviet citizen, dedicated, courageous, and proof that women could equal men in any endeavor. This narrative served Soviet ideological purposes, and Lyudmila played her assigned role, though the constant performance of her public persona grew increasingly wearying. In 1943, she was promoted to the rank of major, a substantial promotion recognizing both her combat record and her service in training and propaganda roles. She received additional decorations, including the Gold Star of Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. These awards were deserved recognition of extraordinary service, but they also furthered her transformation from person to symbol. She was becoming a historical figure even while still in her 20s, her real experiences fossilizing into official narrative. As the war progressed toward Allied victory, the massive casualties and destruction became fully apparent. The Soviet Union had suffered losses on a scale almost beyond comprehension. Estimates suggest 27 million Soviet citizens dead, including perhaps 10 million military personnel. Entire cities had been destroyed. Industrial regions were devastated. The trauma inflicted on Soviet society would echo for generations. Lyudmila had survived when the vast majority of those who had fought at Odessa and Sevastopol had not. Survivor's guilt is a common response to this kind of mass death, the question of why one survived when so many others died. She later spoke of this burden, of remembering comrades who had fallen, of wondering what entitled her to survival when braver or more skilled soldiers had been killed. There is no satisfying answer to such questions, only the necessity of continuing to live and to make that survival meaningful. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the war in Europe ended. The victory was genuine and hard-won, purchased with oceans of blood and immeasurable suffering. For Soviet soldiers and civilians, there was relief, exhaustion, and the monumental task of rebuilding a shattered nation. For Lyudmila, then 28 years old, there was the question of what came next. She had been a soldier for 4 years, famous for 2.5 of them. She had killed more enemy soldiers than virtually anyone else in the war. What was she now that the war was over? She chose to return to education, the path her life had been on before the war interrupted. She enrolled to complete her history degree at Kyiv University, returning to the interrupted studies of 1941. But she was not the same person who had left those lecture halls 4 years earlier. The young student interested in historical scholarship had become a combat veteran carrying deep psychological scars. She studied history now while being herself a historical figure whose wartime service would be analyzed by future historians. She completed her degree and continued to graduate studies, eventually earning a master's degree. She worked as a historian, researching and writing about Soviet military history and the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called World War II. There was a certain irony in becoming a historian of the war she had fought in, analyzing and contextualizing events she had lived through from perspectives of scholarship and national narrative. She maintained the official line in her public work: the Soviet Union as heroic victor, Stalin as great wartime leader, the Communist Party as source of national strength, while privately carrying memories of chaos, death, and the moral complexities that official history elided. She married again in the post-war years, a marriage that, like her first, ultimately failed. The details remain private, protected by the reserve she maintained about her personal life. What is known is that relationships were difficult for her, that the psychological wounds of combat did not heal as readily as physical injuries. Many combat veterans struggle with intimate relationships after war, finding it difficult to connect with those who cannot understand their experiences, or dealing with emotional numbness and damage that makes vulnerability and trust extremely difficult. The Soviet Union in the post-war period was beginning its slow transformation from Stalin's brutal dictatorship toward the slightly more liberalized system that would emerge after his death in 1953. The country rebuilt with remarkable speed, restoring industry and cities, though at tremendous human cost. The Cold War emerged as the wartime alliance with the West fractured into ideological and geopolitical confrontation. The Soviet Union became a closed society, isolated from the West, controlled by a paranoid security apparatus, and marked by the trauma of the war and Stalin's purges. In this environment, Lyudmila lived quietly when not fulfilling her occasional public duties. She raised her son, Rostislav, who had grown from child to young man during her years of war and fame. She maintained friendships with other veterans, particularly fellow snipers with whom she could speak honestly about shared experiences. She dealt with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional difficulties, though Soviet psychology did not recognize or treat combat trauma effectively. She received a pension as a disabled veteran and as a hero of the Soviet Union, providing financial security. She worked in various positions related to military history and veteran affairs. She occasionally spoke to military units or at commemorative events, but largely, she withdrew from public life, preferring privacy to the performance her fame demanded. The weight of her combat record never entirely left her. 309 confirmed kills, 309 human beings whose lives she had ended. Each one had been an enemy soldier, part of an army that had invaded her country and committed atrocities across occupied Soviet territory. Each one had represented a threat to her comrades and her nation. The killings had been legitimate acts of war in defense of homeland. But they remained killings, and the psychological burden of taking that many lives affected her profoundly throughout her remaining years. She spoke occasionally about her wartime experiences in interviews, particularly as she aged and the war receded into history. Her accounts were generally consistent with the basic facts but often carefully presented to serve official narratives. The complex moral and psychological realities of combat were simplified into stories of patriotic duty and heroic resistance. She was constrained by Soviet censorship and by her own need to make sense of what she had experienced in ways that allowed her to live with those memories. In the 1960s and 70s, as the war generation aged and began to pass away, there was increased interest in preserving their testimonies. Lyudmila participated in this historical documentation, providing interviews and accounts that would become primary sources for future historians. She was always careful, always aware that her words would be analyzed and interpreted, but she contributed to the historical record as she understood her duty required. Her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt remained meaningful to her throughout her life. When Mrs. Roosevelt visited the Soviet Union in 1957, the two women met again, now both older, marked by the years since their first meeting, but still sharing genuine affection and mutual respect. Mrs. Roosevelt's death in 1962 affected Lyudmila deeply, severing one of her few connections to someone who had known her both as symbol and as person. As the Soviet Union moved through the Khrushchev era and into the Brezhnev period, Lyudmila continued her quiet life. She was occasionally honored at official events, her hero of the Soviet Union status ensuring a certain level of recognition and respect. But she was not seeking attention or celebration. She had done her duty, paid a terrible price for it, and wanted primarily to live peacefully with whatever remained of the person she had been before the war. She aged with the dignity of someone who had survived extraordinary trials. Her health, never fully recovered from her combat wounds and the deprivations of the siege, gradually declined. She dealt with the various ailments common to aging combat veterans: pain from old injuries, stress-related conditions, the accumulated wear of a hard life. But she endured, as she had endured the trenches of Sevastopol, with determination and without complaint. Lyudmila Mikhailovna Pavlichenko died on October 27, 1974, in Moscow. She was 58 years old, not particularly old by modern standards, but her life had been physically and psychologically demanding in ways that aged her beyond her years. The official cause of death was stroke, though the underlying factors included the accumulated damage of a lifetime that had included siege warfare, serious combat wounds, and decades of psychological trauma. Her death was noted officially in the Soviet Union. Veterans' organizations mourned her passing. Newspapers ran obituaries summarizing her extraordinary war record and her post-war service. She was buried with military honors at Moscow's Novodevichy Cemetery, a prestigious burial ground reserved for prominent Soviet citizens. Her grave marker identified her as a hero of the Soviet Union and noted her rank and service. For several years after her death, her legacy remained primarily within Soviet borders. She was remembered by veterans, taught about in Soviet schools as an example of Soviet heroism and women's capabilities, and occasionally referenced in military histories of the Great Patriotic War. But she was not widely known internationally, despite her American tour in 1942. The Cold War had created barriers of information and understanding, and Soviet war heroes were not celebrated in the West the way Western military figures were. This began to change gradually after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. As archives opened and information became more freely available, Western historians gained access to more complete documentation of the Eastern Front. The extraordinary scale and brutality of the war in the East, which had been somewhat abstracted in Western historical consciousness, became more fully understood. Individual stories, like Lyudmila's, emerged from the ideological frameworks that had contained them and could be examined more objectively. Historians researching sniper warfare discovered or rediscovered her record as the most successful female sniper in history. Her confirmed kill count of 309 placed her among the top-performing snipers of World War II regardless of gender or nationality. Only a handful of snipers achieved higher confirmed totals, and those were men who served through longer combat periods. Her achievement was exceptional by any standard, and as her story became known internationally, she gained recognition as one of the war's most formidable combat soldiers. Her story resonated particularly with those interested in women's military history. Throughout most of history, women had been excluded from combat roles in conventional militaries. The Soviet Union during World War II had been unusual in utilizing women in combat positions including snipers, pilots, machine gunners, and tank crew. This had been driven partly by ideology. Soviet communism officially proclaimed gender equality, and partly by desperate necessity, as the catastrophic casualties of 1941 and 42 forced the Soviet Union to mobilize every available person. Lyudmila's record demonstrated that women could perform at the highest levels in combat roles when given proper training and opportunity. This was valuable evidence in ongoing debates about women in combat, debates that continued in many nations well into the 21st century. While individual cases never fully resolved policy debates, her example made it harder to maintain that women were categorically unsuited for combat positions. She had competed directly against male soldiers, enemy and comrade, and proven equal or superior. However, her story also illustrated the costs of combat that apply regardless of gender. The psychological burden she carried, the trauma that marked her remaining years, the difficulty reintegrating into civilian life, these were universal experiences of combat veterans. Her story was not primarily about gender, but about what war does to human beings who participate in its most intimate. Violence. She happened to be a woman, which made her story unusual, but the fundamental experiences of combat, trauma, and survival were shared with countless male veterans. In Ukraine, the nation of her birth, she was remembered with particular pride. After Ukraine gained independence from the Soviet Union, Lyudmila was claimed as a Ukrainian hero as well as a Soviet one. Streets were named after her. Memorials were erected. Her story was taught to new generations as an example of Ukrainian courage and capability. This national claiming of her legacy sometimes elided the complex reality that she had fought for the Soviet Union, not for an independent Ukraine, and that her identity had been formed within Soviet rather than purely Ukrainian contexts. But national heroes are often adopted and reshaped to fit contemporary needs, and Lyudmila became a symbol for multiple narratives. Russia also claimed her as a national hero, part of the great patriotic war mythology that remains central to Russian national identity even after the Soviet Union's collapse. Victory over Nazi Germany was perhaps the most important unifying element in Russian historical consciousness, and war heroes like Lyudmila were honored as embodiments of that triumph. Her story was presented in Russian sources as an example of Russian courage, sometimes with the Ukrainian elements of her background minimized or ignored. This competing national claiming of her legacy reflected broader tensions between Russia and Ukraine that would eventually erupt into open conflict. Lyudmila had fought for a Soviet Union that no longer existed, against a Nazi Germany that had been defeated decades earlier. Her actual identity and motivations were complex and rooted in a specific historical context that was difficult to map onto contemporary national identities and conflicts. But symbols are powerful, and nations at odds will claim the same heroes for opposite purposes. In recent years, particularly in Western popular culture, there has been increased interest in her story. Books have been written, including biographies attempting to reconstruct her life from available sources. Documentary films have examined her wartime service and its psychological impact. Her story has appeared in various media, exploring women's military history and the Eastern Front. This increased attention has brought her recognition to audiences who knew little or nothing about the Soviet experience of World War II. However, this popularization has also created challenges for historical accuracy. Lyudmila's story is dramatic enough in its actual details that embellishment should be unnecessary. Yet popular retellings often add invented elements, inflate already impressive achievements, or simplify complex realities into clearer narratives. The same tensions between truth and myth-making that mark the Maeskline story affect Lyudmila's legacy, though to a lesser degree because her core record is substantially documented and verified. Her confirmed kill total of 309 is sometimes inflated in popular accounts, with numbers reaching 500 or more appearing in unreliable sources. These inflations are unnecessary. Her actual record is extraordinary and places her among the most successful snipers in history. But the human tendency toward exaggeration and the appeal of larger numbers means that false figures circulate and become accepted despite lacking documentary support. Similarly, some accounts present her as having single-handedly changed the course of battles, or as having been the sole effective sniper on the entire Sevastopol front. The reality was more complex. She was one of many skilled Soviet snipers, operating within a larger defensive system where individual contributions, however impressive, were parts of collective efforts. Recognizing this does not diminish her achievement but places it in proper historical context. There have been calls at various times to posthumously award her additional recognition, including proposals for international honors acknowledging her extraordinary service. These proposals reflect genuine admiration but also sometimes serve contemporary political purposes, using her legacy to advance current agendas. She herself might have been uncomfortable with such uses, preferring to be remembered simply as a soldier who did her duty in terrible circumstances. Her legacy extends beyond military history into broader cultural impacts. She remains an inspirational figure for women in many fields, not just military service. Her story demonstrates that women can excel in roles traditionally reserved for men when barriers are removed and genuine opportunity provided. She performed under extreme pressure in a male-dominated environment and proved equal to any challenge. This resonates with contemporary struggles for gender equality across many domains. At the same time, her story serves as a cautionary tale about the costs of war and the lasting impacts of combat trauma. She achieved extraordinary military success and paid an extraordinary psychological price. She survived when most of her comrades did not, and carried the burden of that survival through decades of difficult post-war life. Her legacy includes not just the heroism but the suffering, not just the triumph but the trauma. A complete understanding of her life requires acknowledging both. Perhaps most importantly, Lyudmila Pavlichenko's story serves as a reminder of the individual human beings behind the vast statistics of the Second World War. 27 million Soviet dead is a number so large as to be almost incomprehensible. 309 enemy soldiers killed is also a number that risks becoming abstracted. But each was a person. Lyudmila herself, each soldier she killed, each comrade who died beside her. The meaning of war is ultimately found in these individual stories of fear, courage, loss, and endurance, not in the grand strategic narratives or ideological frameworks. The Iron Angel, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the world's deadliest female sniper. Continued documentary narrative. If Lyudmila Pavlichenko could observe how her legacy has developed in the decades since her death, she would likely have mixed feelings. She had spent her post-war years trying to reconcile who she had been in combat with who she became in peace, struggling to integrate the soldier and the civilian, the killer and the historian, the symbol and the person. Her story has been told and retold, shaped by different agendas and perspectives, sometimes honoring the truth of her experience and sometimes distorting it for contemporary purposes. What remains undeniable, stripped of propaganda and mythology, is the core reality of what she accomplished and what it cost her. In approximately 10 months of frontline combat at Odessa and Sevastopol, from August 1941 to June 1942, she killed 309 enemy soldiers with verified accuracy. This was not abstract violence delivered from a distance by artillery or aircraft, but intimate, individual killing where she saw each target clearly and made conscious decisions to end specific lives. The psychological burden of this work was immense and permanent. She did this as a 24 and 25-year-old woman in an army and society that, despite official ideology about gender equality, had not fully accepted women as combat soldiers. She had to prove herself repeatedly, demonstrate capability under fire, and earn respect through performance. She operated in siege conditions of terrible deprivation, under constant bombardment, surrounded by mass death. She was wounded seriously enough to require evacuation, survived when the vast majority of Sevastopol's defenders did not, and bore survivors' guilt for the remainder of her life. After combat, she served in ways her country demanded, as a propaganda figure, as a symbol, as an instructor, as a public face for Soviet heroism. She fulfilled these roles with the same discipline she had shown in combat, even when the performances were exhausting and the attention unwelcome. She returned to education, completed advanced degrees, worked as a historian, and tried to build a life that made sense after the intensity and horror of war. She largely succeeded, though the psychological scars remained until her death. Her story illustrates truths about war that transcend her individual experience. War transforms those who participate in it, especially those in combat roles. The person who returns from war is not the same person who went. The changes are psychological, moral, and existential. Lyudmila went to war as a university student who knew how to shoot. She returned as a veteran who had killed more enemy soldiers than almost any other woman in recorded history. That transformation was irreversible and carried costs that never fully healed. Her story also demonstrates that courage and capability are not determined by gender. When given proper training, appropriate equipment, and genuine opportunity, women can perform combat roles at the highest levels. Lyudmila was not unique among Soviet women. Thousands of women served as snipers, pilots, machine gunners, tank crew, and infantry soldiers. Many performed with exceptional skill and courage. Their collective record disproves categorical claims about women's unsuitability for combat. Individual variation in capability exists within any gender, but gender itself does not determine capacity for courage, skill, or endurance under fire. At the same time, her story reveals that combat trauma affects all who experience it, regardless of gender. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the difficulty with intimate relationships, the burden of having killed, these were universal experiences of combat veterans. She was not spared these impacts because she was a woman, nor did she experience unique forms of trauma solely because of her gender. The fundamental horror of war and its psychological aftermath were the same for her as for male combat veterans. The context in which she fought matters for understanding her story. The Eastern Front was war at its most brutal and existential. This was not a conflict over territory or resources that might be resolved through diplomacy and compromise. Nazi ideology defined Slavic peoples as subhuman and designated them for enslavement or extermination. German forces and their allies committed systematic atrocities across occupied Soviet territory. Soviet soldiers knew that defeat meant not just military loss but genocide of their people. This context explains the fierce resistance, the willingness to endure terrible casualties, and the absolute determination to fight to final victory regardless of cost. Lyudmila's motivation was not primarily ideological commitment to communism, though she lived in a society saturated with communist ideology and undoubtedly internalized some of its values. Her motivation was defense of homeland, protection of her people, revenge for atrocities, and survival. These are immediate, visceral motivations that transcend political ideology. She fought because her country was invaded, her people were dying, and she had skills that could contribute to their defense. This is comprehensible across cultures and political systems. Most people would fight under similar circumstances. Her choice to serve as a sniper rather than in support roles reflected personal determination, and perhaps a desire to prove capability in a domain where women were presumed inferior. Sniping is an elite role requiring exceptional skill, patience, and nerve. By insisting on serving as a sniper rather than accepting assignment to nursing or logistics, she challenged assumptions about women's proper roles. Her success in that role validated her choice and demonstrated that assumptions about gendered capabilities were often unfounded. However, it's important not to romanticize this choice or its consequences. Sniping is necessary in war but psychologically devastating for those who do it. The intimate nature of sniper killing, selecting individual targets, watching them through magnified optics, making conscious decisions to kill specific people, observing the results, creates unique psychological burdens. Lyudmila's choice to become a sniper was brave and served her nation, but it also condemned her to decades of psychological suffering. This is not to suggest she made the wrong choice, but to acknowledge that her choice had costs that she bore for the rest of her life. Her post-war struggles with trauma, relationships, and reintegration into civilian life were typical of combat veterans but were likely complicated by the fact that very few people, even other veterans, had experienced combat in the way she had. Male combat veterans could discuss their experiences with millions of other men who had fought. Female snipers like Lyudmila were far fewer, and the social isolation of having experiences that almost no one else shared likely intensified the psychological burden. She found some support among fellow female veterans, but the numbers were small and the social context often dismissive of women's combat experiences. The question of how to remember her, and what lessons to draw from her story, remains contested. For some, she is primarily a symbol of women's capabilities and a challenge to traditional gender roles. For others, she is a national hero whose story reinforces patriotic narratives about their nation's suffering and triumph in World War II. For military historians, she is a case study in sniper effectiveness and the psychological impacts of that role. For those concerned with combat trauma, she exemplifies the long-term costs of war on those who fight it. All of these perspectives capture elements of her story, but none is complete alone. She was a woman who broke barriers, a patriot who served her nation, a highly effective soldier who excelled at a deadly craft, and a trauma survivor who struggled with the psychological aftermath of that service. Any understanding that emphasizes one dimension while ignoring others fails to capture the full complexity of her life and legacy. Perhaps the most respectful way to remember Lyudmila Pavlichenko is simply as a soldier who did her duty under the most terrible circumstances imaginable, who performed with exceptional skill and courage, who paid a heavy price for that service, and who tried with mixed success to live a meaningful life afterward. She was neither a perfect hero without flaws nor a victim without agency. She was a human being who faced extraordinary challenges and responded with determination, skill, and courage while bearing the very human costs that such challenges impose. Her grave at Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow remains a site of pilgrimage for those who honor her memory. Visitors leave flowers, particularly on Victory Day commemorations of the end of World War II. Some leave notes thanking her for her service. Others leave tokens acknowledging her as a feminist icon. Still others simply stand quietly, reflecting on a life so different from their own, trying to imagine what it meant to be 24 years old, lying in rubble with a rifle, deciding which enemy soldier would die next, day after day, through months of siege and slaughter. The cemetery is peaceful, far from the battlefields where she fought. Trees provide shade. Birds sing. The present seems very distant from the past she inhabited. But memory persists, carried forward by those who study history, who value courage, who recognize sacrifice, or who simply understand that individual stories illuminate historical events in ways that statistics and strategic analyses cannot. In the end, Lyudmila Pavlichenko's legacy is found not in the numbers, 309 confirmed kills, 10 months of combat, numerous decorations, but in what her story reveals about human capacity for courage and endurance, about the costs of war, about the way societies remember and forget their heroes, and about the complex reality of women in combat. She lived an extraordinary life that began in ordinary circumstances, was transformed by catastrophic war, and concluded in the difficult peace that survivors must make with their pasts. She was not perfect. She was shaped by Soviet ideology and propaganda in ways that likely distorted her public accounts of her experiences. She participated in a totalitarian system that committed terrible crimes, though her personal involvement was in legitimate defensive combat against an existential threat. She became a symbol used for political purposes, sometimes willingly and sometimes not. Her story has been claimed by competing national narratives and simplified into inspirational tales that allied the moral complexities and psychological costs of what she actually experienced. But through all the propaganda, mythology, and political appropriation, the core truth remains. A young woman who should have lived a life of scholarship and teaching instead became one of history's most lethal soldiers. She killed 309 enemy combatants with precision and efficiency. She survived siege warfare that killed tens of thousands. She bore the psychological burden of that killing for the remaining 32 years of her life. She tried to make that survival meaningful through continued service to her nation and through returning to the life of the mind that had been interrupted by war. She deserves to be remembered accurately, without the embellishments that popular culture adds, but also without the cynical dismissals that sometimes accompany discussions of Soviet wartime propaganda. Her achievements were real. Her suffering was real. Her courage was real. Her trauma was real. All of these truths can coexist, and all are necessary for understanding who she actually was rather than who various narratives need her to have been. The title Iron Angel captures something essential about Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the combination of deadly effectiveness and underlying humanity, of strength and vulnerability, of the warrior and the woman. She was iron in her determination, her skill, her endurance under conditions that would have broken many others. She was angelic in the sense that she fought in defense of her people against an evil that threatened their extinction, though there was nothing soft or sentimental about how she conducted that fight. But the metaphor has limitations. Angels, in religious and mythological traditions, are beings without human weakness or moral complexity. Lyudmila was profoundly human, afraid, damaged, struggling, surviving. She was not elevated above human concerns but deeply embedded in them. She killed enemy soldiers not from abstract duty but from immediate necessity and rage at what the invaders had done to her country. She suffered not nobly but with the messy, difficult reality of all trauma survivors. She was heroic and broken, strong and vulnerable, exceptional and utterly human. The Eastern Front of World War II produced millions of stories of suffering, courage, and survival. Most are lost, known only to those who lived them and carried to graves now marked only by dates on stone. Some were recorded, becoming part of the historical archive that allows subsequent generations to understand what happened. Very few became famous, elevated into public consciousness as symbols or representatives of the broader experience. Lyudmila's story became one of those few that achieved lasting recognition. This was partly because her achievement was exceptional, the most successful female sniper in history, a record that stands out even in a war full of extraordinary individual records. It was partly because Soviet authorities recognized her propaganda value and promoted her story during and after the war. It was partly because her story combined elements that captured imagination. A young woman becoming a deadly warrior, defending homeland against evil invaders, achieving almost unimaginable success in a traditionally male role. But ultimately, her story persists because it tells us something true about human capacity and human cost. We need to know that ordinary people can rise to extraordinary challenges when necessity demands it. We need to understand that gender does not determine capability or courage. We need to remember that war, even necessary and justified war, damages those who fight it in ways that last lifetimes. We need to honor those who serve while acknowledging the complexity and cost of that service. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was a university student in Kyiv who became history's deadliest female sniper, who killed 309 enemy soldiers in defense of her homeland, who suffered terrible wounds physical and psychological, who served her nation as symbol and instructor and historian, who struggled through a difficult post-war life marked by trauma and memory, who maintained friendships across political divides, who died at 58 with her psychological wounds never fully healed, and who left a legacy that continues to provoke thought, debate, and respect more than 5 decades after her death. She was the Iron Angel, strong enough to endure what few could endure, carrying burdens that would have crushed many others, fighting with skill and courage against overwhelming odds, surviving when most did not, and bearing the costs of survival with dignity if not with peace. Her story is one of millions from that terrible war, but it is told more fully than most, and in its telling, it illuminates something of what that war meant for those who fought it and those who remember them. The battlefields where she fought have long since been transformed. Sevastopol was rebuilt after the war, restored to its role as a significant Black Sea port. The trenches and ruins where she crouched with her rifle, where she killed and watched comrades die, where she was wounded and nearly killed, these are gone, covered by new construction or reclaimed by nature. The physical landscape bears little trace of the hell it witnessed in 1941 and 42. But memory persists, carried in documents, photographs, testimonies, and stories passed down through generations. Lyudmila's image, young, intense, in uniform with her sniper rifle, remains as testimony to what happened there, to what she did, to what it cost. That image has become iconic, reproduced in books and films and websites, recognized by people who know nothing else about the Eastern Front. It speaks without words of courage, determination, and the terrible things that war demands of those who fight it. In the years since her death, the world has changed in ways she could not have imagined. The Soviet Union she served collapsed. The Cold War that dominated her post-war world ended. New conflicts erupted, including in Ukraine where she was born. Technology transformed warfare, though snipers remain relevant despite drones and precision weapons. Women's roles in military forces expanded in many nations, with combat positions opening that had long been closed. The debates about women in combat that her story informed continue in new contexts. Through all these changes, her record stands: 309 confirmed kills, the most successful female sniper in recorded history, a performance that places her among the most effective combat soldiers of World War II regardless of gender. This is not a record to celebrate, exactly. It represents 309 deaths, 309 families who lost sons or husbands or fathers, 309 lives ended by one person's skill and decision. But it is a record to acknowledge, to remember, and to understand as part of the larger story of the deadliest conflict in human history. Lyudmila Pavlichenko fought in defense of her homeland against an enemy that threatened genocide. She fought with exceptional skill and courage. She survived when most around her died. She carried the burden of what she had done for the rest of her life. She tried to make her survival meaningful through continued service and the difficult work of building a life in the shadow of war. She succeeded in some ways and struggled in others, as most people do when facing extraordinary circumstances and their aftermath. She was the Iron Angel, and she was human, with all that implies of strength and vulnerability, triumph and trauma, memory and forgetting. Her story deserves to be told accurately, remembered respectfully, and understood in all its complexity. Not as simple heroism or simple tragedy, but as the full, difficult, extraordinary reality of one person's experience in the most terrible war humanity has yet inflicted upon itself. May we remember her not just for what she achieved, but for what it cost her. May we honor her service without romanticizing the violence she committed in that service. May we learn from her story about human capability and human cost, about courage and trauma, about what war demands and what it leaves behind. And may we work toward a world where such courage is never again necessary, where young students can complete their degrees in peace, where no one must become what war made Lyudmila Pavlichenko become.